I'm going to sort of try to just give you some perspective from our experience. Town, my company, is a SME developer, the kind that the government professes to want to encourage more of, but which are still fairly thin on the ground owing to the structure of the industry in the UK. And I'm going to try to sort of talk both about Marmalade Lane and about the lessons from it that are relevant in the UK and hopefully in India, around how we can get more sort of community-led and resident-produced projects. So talking about Marmalade Lane, Marmalade Lane is a community of 42 dwellings, about 105 people at the moment on a 1 hectare site, an almost perfectly sort of orthogonal 1 hectare site in Orchard Park in Cambridge. It was the last but one parcel of a larger urban extension called Orchard Park, which at the time that Marmalade Lane was brought forward had already had around 800 homes delivered, mostly by speculative volume house builders during the 2000s. Quite a good master plan with a reasonable block structure, but just not executed well because of poor architecture and construction, and just for a place with pretty good public transport connections, including the Cambridge guided busway, but what really are rather excessive parking requirements. The area had a reputation for transience and low engagement, partly because many of the private homes had been turned into HMOs. Basically, the challenge Cambridge has as a booming city is that its housing has not kept up, and so quite a lot of people are squashed into relatively small multi-family households. And the land parcel, which was known as Parcel K1, was owned by Cambridge City Council, and it was approached in the late noughties to pilot some community-led housing. A sale of the site to another volume house builder having fallen through in the financial crash. Now, Town won the developer competition in 2015, which was really well designed to allow new entrants to compete, and the scheme was completed in 2018. Here we are at the groundbreaking in more senses than one with the group, and the project was really governed throughout by deep collaboration between the development team and the community group. In particular, we and our delivery partners, Trivselhus, which is a Swedish timber framing company, effectively set up a process that involved the residents from the outset, taking their high-level brief and turning it into detailed design solutions, and indeed management strategies and sales processes for the scheme as a whole, looking at different work streams of the key components of the co-housing community. So briefly to summarise those, takes a very low carbon approach with what now needs to become the norm, but in 2015 it still wasn't normal not to have natural gas as your heating. Air source heat pumps will be everywhere now in the UK, but they weren't at the time. So the system is built in timber. It uses two modern methods of construction: a cross-laminated timber panel and a closed timber panel for the lower-rise houses. Triple glazing, mechanical ventilation and heat recovery, and as I mentioned, heat pumps. We offered, so although the scheme is based on a small number of repeating dwelling shells, effectively, residents who were involved from the outset got directly involved in the customisation of their homes. So within a given volume, you could have a different number of bedrooms, different internal layouts in terms of more or less open plan, and different external finishing choices. And the range of unit types and sizes was sort of concealed in a terrace, very kind of vernacular Cambridge style brick terrace, which meant that actually you did have 1-bed ground floor flats next to 5-bed townhouses, and it was all quite nicely mixed in and concealed. Common house is key to any co-housing group. It's where the community lives, in effect, comes together. This is the quite large common house at Cambridge, which basically dining hall, lounge, there's kids' playroom off to the left, etc. And pre-pandemic, incredibly well used by the residents. And at the centre of the scheme is a car-free lane, which provides fantastic safe space for play and neighbourly interaction, and complements the sort of large shared garden that is the other main piece of outside space. And that's partly achieved by keeping car parking at a low level into the edge of the site. Parking was provided at one space per dwelling, and there's currently a planning application going through to reduce that down to about 0.7, because members don't really have many cars. And what is incredible when you go there now, obviously developer sort of finishes when it achieves practical completion, although one of our members of staff actually lives in Marmalade Lane, so we do get a good update on how it's going. But the process, as much as the buildings, are what build the community, and people feel a real sense of ownership and get to know their neighbours through that process. And it's a wonderful place for kids in particular. So I want to highlight, I think, 5 kind of learning points from it. I think the dividing line in UK housing, and in a way we sort of picked up on some commonalities, I suppose, in the culture in India on this as well, is between, if you like, what I would call speculative and purposive development. Most new housing is delivered speculatively, and it's essentially delivered by a relatively small cabal of large organisations who have very, very weak competitive pressure and therefore no incentive to innovate. Whereas more purposive development, which is kind of long term, clearly driven by a mission, and that includes community-led housing. It isn't solely limited to it, but that's probably the main form, and co-housing is essentially a subset of community-led housing. The second is that the support of the local authority and or long-term institutions is important, mainly because they control land more than anything else. So obviously local authorities as planning authorities or highways authorities exert an influence, but the key thing is the ability to access land from organisations that should have a long-term perspective on their place. The third is that this was a developer-enabled scheme. One of the things that really unifies a lot of community-led housing projects in the UK is that they never get built, and one of the reasons is that doing it genuinely DIY is incredibly difficult and time-consuming. And while it has been done, so examples like Lilac in Leeds would be a good one. Generally, the melding of professional expertise and some sort of good rules around what makes good places is really important alongside community participation. It really needs to be a partnership. And then I think, just in terms of thinking about 2 points, really, to think about how we try and make this bigger. Marmalade Lane was a really nice size. It's relatively big as co-housing groups go. There's a concept called Dunbar's number, which some of you will be familiar with, which is essentially, it's the number of people within which essentially you can form meaningful community bonds, and essentially it tops out at about 100 to 120, and beyond that you're less likely to know be able to form sort of stable neighbourly relationships with your neighbours, because there's just too many people to know. And the interesting thing about Marmalade Lane is, although it's not particularly dense at 42 dwellings per hectare, it could have been developed more densely for sure. The scale of a 1 hectare urban block is both a really good sort of spatial piece at which to grow a town or a city in a sensible, logical way with a good grid of legibility and so forth, and it also allows you to build communities and settlements that allow Dunbar's number of the number of people who can really form meaningful neighbourly bonds to thrive. So actually, if you're thinking about large scale growth, and can get out of the world of just thinking about massive parcels of hundreds of dwellings at a time, and actually into how cities used to grow block by block and street by street, there's actually a really good affinity there. And then the last point is really around the challenge of scaling up innovation. Marmalade Lane was finished 3 years ago. There isn't another one yet. And so, although it's won loads of awards and is lauded, and you can go there and just see like what a wonderful life it gives the people who live there. Nobody's been rushing to do another one, and that's because fundamentally the UK is absolutely terrible at actually learning from exemplars and building on them, and because as I say, we have a we have a supply side that is incredibly dominated by a small number, what economists call an oligopoly, small number of big players who have very little competitive pressure and therefore no incentive to innovate. So there is a thing about getting the regulatory regime right. And if you're trying to make a market, thinking about how that can result in more than one or two interesting but ultimately isolated examples. Thank you.